This exercise is going to be working with texture, and it's going to be using Photoshop to incorporate textures into your digital images. So texture is something that I think is overlooked a lot within digital artworks, especially when people are generating most of their imagery from within a digital environment. And I think that that has something to do with the fact that when you start a new document in most digital environments, you start with this very white, clean, pristine canvas. And it's definitely something that a lot of artists and artworks use to develop layers of meaning. In this week's lecture modules, you're going to be seeing lots of instances of how different textures can develop meaning and how they can communicate ideas and meaning just with their visual appearance. And this is definitely something that happens with sculpture and with 3D works, but it's also something that happens with 2D works and more paintings. And that is where either the artist is incorporating textures into the actual paint, or they're creating images that look like they're heavily textured, or they're trying to approximate and represent a texture through the use of their painting or whatever they're using to produce the image. So the image that you see here is a artwork entitled Target, and it's by Jasper Johns, and this was done in the 1960s. And Jasper Johns was a painter who started bringing in and incorporating a lot of elements of texture into his works. And so you actually see two examples of this in this particular piece, where the area in the top, those are actually molds of, I think, his different body parts, mostly his face. And then also on the bottom, within the target, you see the texture that he's created using just the different layers of paint. And so both of these are different examples of an artist bringing in texture. And with those textures, he's giving viewers another way to connect, another way to read meaning, another layer of understanding into the artwork. And it's definitely, again, something that I think gets a little bit overlooked with digital work, because it is starting off in this clean kind of environment. And I think that for a long time, it's been seen as almost something that isn't desirable in digital work, because there is this kind of clean aesthetic that goes with digital things. And I think that, again, as this technology is getting pushed more and more, and as more artists are using these tools to not only create works that are screen-based, but to just create experimentations that then they can use as guides for work that they're producing, whether it's using screen printing or painting or illustration that's outside of the computer and the digital environment. This is a consideration that I think is one that should be being made. And so whether or not you're planning on printing whatever you're working on within these digital tools, or if it's just going to be screen-based, you want texture to be something that you are actually thinking about. Because again, it is an opportunity for you to develop meaning for the viewer and also for yourself. So let's go into the exercise. So for this exercise, I had you capture two different textures from the environment around you, the physical environment around you, and one was going to be more manufactured, and then the other one was going to be natural. So I went with a wood grain for the natural, and then this is a little speaker that I captured, and then I also did some headphones, and I'm not sure if I'm going to use those for this particular exercise. So I want you to take these two textures and then incorporate them into the color and pattern exercise from before. So there's going to be instructions on how to capture these textures. It's using a process. It's basically just rubbing. I did this with pencil and just with regular paper, and using different tools for that is going to produce slightly different results. But I will discuss that more in the explanation and description of this particular process. But for now, I have these in Photoshop, and I'm going to incorporate them into this previous exercise. So the first one I'm going to work with is the wood grain, and I'm going to use the levels to try and make that texture a little bit more pronounced. So I want to be, actually first, I'm going to make this black and white, because as I'm adjusting the levels, I was seeing before I did that there was some blues that were coming in, and I don't want that. So I just want to get a nice, crisp, black and white, as much as I can, approximation of this texture. And there's a reason why I'm going to be doing this. Okay, so I have that now. So now I'm going to show you how to do a selection that is based on color, and it's called a color range. And so it's under the selection menu, and you go to color range. And right now I want to select, I basically want to isolate all the areas that are black and then none of the areas that are white. And this is going to help me when I bring this into the other image that I'm going to be working with. So what I'm going to do is I have the fuzziness here set to 0, and that's going to keep me from this incorporating a lot of half pixels or different levels of opacity or different grays, because I really just want to get the areas that are very dark. I'm going to hit that little eyedropper. So I'm clicking the eyedropper in a place on this little test image that I know is white. And what this is going to be doing is this is basically saying I want to select every single pixel that is white and nothing else. And then I'm going to go over here. I'm going to go to invert. So now it's going to be selecting every pixel that is not white. I'm going to say OK. And then within this image, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to select my paint bucket tool by hitting G, and then I'm actually going to make this black, and I'm going to fill that in. All right, so you don't notice that much of a difference, but if you hide the background, then you see that you have this texture, and now the areas that were white are now completely transparent, and then the only areas that are filled are the areas that were black. So now I'm going to Command and copy this. I'm going to switch over to that image. I'm going to select the top layer, and then I'm just going to paste. And that way I make sure that it pastes onto the top of all the layers. Okay. So this is a very large image because I didn't resize it. And I did that partially on purpose because, let's see here, because I wanted to be able to work with different sizes of this. And if you resize something and then try to make it bigger, then you start to lose quality. So it's always better to start with a larger size piece. So right now I'm using the transform tool on this layer to size it down a little bit. And I'm going to talk about that more in upcoming modules. But the way I was able to do that was to do Command T, which is the shortcut to transform, or you can go up to Edit. And then once you have something selected, you would go to Free Transform. And I had to make that selection first, which I did by selecting Command A. So I'm getting this down to a size that I wanted to take up a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to then press Enter, which is how you tell the transform tool, okay, I'm done with the transformation, and now I want to keep it the way that it is. All right, oops. And so what's been happening, and there's a way to turn this off that I will go into in the next module, but so now more recent versions of Photoshop will let you select layers by clicking them within the canvas. That can be very helpful, especially when people are frustrated and don't understand why they're not seeing the edits that they're making on a particular layer. However, when you're working with an image that like we have with this, a layer that like we have with this texture, it becomes problematic because there's so many transparent parts of this layer that I'm trying to move it around, and I don't necessarily want to have to try and find an image that, or part of that layer that actually has pixels in it in order to move it. Because if I click in an area that doesn't have pixels on that layer, it will actually just then select the layer that I end up clicking on that has pixels, which is all the way down to the background. So I'll try not to do that, and I'll try to remember that, and then in the future modules, I will definitely talk about how to disable that. Some people like it. All right, so I have this texture, and I think that I want this to only show up in the areas that are blue in the background. So I'm going to keep this texture selected, and then I'm going to go over to this background image, and I'm going to, when I have my cursor over the little thumbnail image of the background blue, I'm going to hit the Command key and then click it. And then what that does is that selects all the pixels within that layer, and it doesn't select the areas that are transparent. So what I've just done is that I've created a selection that is based on this background layer that I can then use, again, as a guide for different things. And I actually want to invert that selection, so I'm going to go Command-Shift-I, which is also under inverse under the select menu, because what I want to do is I want to clear any areas that aren't blue from this top texture layer. So I'm going to now delete that and deselect, and now you can see this texture is only on the areas that are also filled in the background blue layer. Okay, so you can, using this as a guide, you can start, now that you have this layer in the areas that you want it to be in, you can then play around with different blending modes. And so one thing to keep in mind is the reason why I took out all that white is so that this area would be transparent. So the part that wasn't reflecting a texture is now transparent, and the part that was capturing part of the texture is there and present. So let me go to then this manufactured texture. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go black and white. Okay. Levels. Get a nice clean black and white as much as I can image. Select color range. And I'm getting the inverse. So let me, okay. All right, and I'm gonna make a new layer, select my paint bucket tool, black and white. Now I'm gonna select all, copy, go back over here, and then paste it again. All right, and then going to transform again. So Command T, bounding box, just to adjust the scale. I'm holding down Shift to retain the proportions. You don't necessarily have to do that. All right, and I'm really interested in getting to that little mesh pattern that was on top of the speaker there. Okay, so I'm actually going to keep it at this scale. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to press Enter. So now I want this mesh pattern to only be showing up on the orange. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go over to that orange, and I know that the top layer of that orange is the one that is the most opaque, and is that bright orange. That the bottom part is a multiply. So I'm going to select this again. So I'm going to press Command and then holding the cursor over that layer's thumbnail. And so now I'm going to go back up to that texture. I'm going to invert the selection, and let me show you what happens. So if I wanted only the orange to be showing through, I would then just delete the layer that has, in the texture, I would just be deleting the areas where that orange is. But I don't want that, so I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to invert that, and then I'm going to delete everything except for where that orange texture was. Okay, so I deselected, and now I have that. So this is incorporating the two textures and using primarily the selection tool, again, as a guide layer, and then also being able to make selections based on your color layers to incorporate that texture a little bit more. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you in terms of selecting different layers and working with these textures, let's say I wanted to change the color of this texture. So I brought it in as black, and I mean, there's a couple ways to do this. I could use the paint bucket tool. Let's say I wanted to make this another, like a yellow that matches the one that's already in here. So I could use the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to try and apply it. Oh, no, that didn't work so well. All right, I'm going to try and get it on. Okay, this is a very, oh, no, undo. Uh-oh. So this is a slow process, right? And on top of that, it is disrupting the texture that you brought in. So if you wanted to then change that color again, you'd have to go back and then try and use the paint bucket again. And every time you use the paint bucket, when you're applying it to the exact pixels on the same layer, it ends up just slightly lowering the resolution of that. So you start losing more and more detail. So an easier way to do this, I'm going to go back up, I'm going to deselect, is you can select the entire layer. So all the pixels on a layer, again, Command, holding the cursor over that thumbnail and selecting it. And then I'm going to make a new layer on the top, and I'm going to apply that fill there. All right, so now I can hide this, and then the layer is still there below, but I also have it here in yellow. And you can also change the layer order. So, and that's just by dragging and dropping. So I'm going to go over here to this yellow. I actually want it to be below the black, and then I'm going to move. It's going to be really hard to do that with the black on top. Oops. So I'm going to move this a little bit and then put this back on. So now we have these different layers that are based on the same guide layer, and these different layers of texture that are based on both the texture that I was importing and the shapes that I had from that guide layer. And I'm playing around with the way that they're placed on this image. And then you can also play with different blending modes and create these more subtle textures if you want. And then you can also go through and hide some of the color layers now that you've used to create these layers of texture, because maybe you don't need them. So this is a good starting off point to start bringing in the textures that you captured from your environment and bringing them into your self-portrait exercise where you had worked with color and pattern. And again, make sure to save this as a different file. So you want to make sure to save the Photoshop file for this as exercise 2 or whatever number exercise this is, and make sure that it's a different file than the previous one that you had done with just the color and texture. Even though it's starting with the same Photoshop file, you just want to keep all these different Photoshop files separate in case you want to go back and make changes to them. So yes, save the Photoshop file and then follow the posted instructions to export this exercise and to submit it. And as for the textures, you don't need to save those as Photoshop files. You can just, again, follow the instructions and submit those as posted.